But it's great to be here with you all. Just to get a sense of who's here, how many of you are currently CBS students? Columbia undergrad? And people who are graduates of either? Okay, great. And how many are just none of those categories? Okay, that's great. Well, hopefully we'll have time at the end. How long do we want to go?
We've got until 8 o'clock.
Okay, yeah, I'll stick around and happy to answer questions. Hopefully we can have a bit of a conversation. But I just wanted to just begin a little bit about talking about my own journey with my own career and impact investing, and then really get at the end to answering the question that at least some of you might be here to both hear me describe as well as discuss yourselves, and that is, what does this all mean in the age of Trump and Brexit? And I first posed that question, some of you might remember, 2 years ago in, I think it was January of 2017, when we really didn't know what was going to happen. Trump had been elected a few weeks earlier. He had just imposed the craziness of the travel ban and restrictions, and it was a very disorienting time. And it's interesting to look back and realize we're still here. It's kind of crazy when you look back and realize how you had no idea how things would unfold. And they've unfolded in a lot of crazy ways. But I do think the question of what does this all mean in the age of Trump and Brexit is an important one, which I'll get to at the end. But in order to get there, I really wanted to begin with how I got here. And when I was a student, I definitely would not have anticipated that I would be here in a suit with my haircut, talking to you guys about investments. Because I really did believe when I was a student that the world was really divided into two people. There were those people who tried to save the world by either being in nonprofits or government, and there were people who sold out to the man. And that was kind of my worldview, and it's a worldview that a lot of people who are older than 30 probably carried throughout their lives. It's pretty amazing that for some of you, it doesn't seem obvious that that's how people think about the world. And for some of you, the fact that we're standing here talking about impact investing is actually banal. Like, of course we are. A lot of people have worked really hard to bring us to the point where we can actually have a conversation that's about a world that is more complicated than simply one in which the only way to make money is through investments and the only way to solve problems is through government and charity. And so, I think if the one thing we all have in common as impact investors is that none of us can explain to our families what we do for a living, which on one hand is a little alienating. It makes Thanksgiving hard. I see some head nods. It's also kind of bonding because when you do meet other impact investors who are on the same journey, it's pretty powerful. And like I said, I was certainly someone who 20 years ago would have been on the side of not only not understanding it, but being quite skeptical. Because when I graduated college, I was really convinced that in order to live a morally principled life, I had to not get involved with finance and business, and instead go and work in government and nonprofits. And so I graduated college in 1996, and I returned to South Africa, where I grew up earlier. I talk like this because I moved here when I was 10 and had the accent beaten out of me in middle school. But it was an exciting time. In 1996, those of you who know Southern African history, Nelson Mandela had been released from prison in 1990. He had become president of South Africa in 1994. And about a month before I arrived in the fall of 1996, the South African government had put into effect a new constitution that made us as South Africans the most liberated people the earth had ever known. On paper, we not only had all the rights that Americans talk about when we talk about the great rights we have about freedom, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, and so forth. We also had a whole set of rights related to what are called positive rights. We had, under the Constitution, the right to housing, the right to water, the right to education. And in addition, in 1996, we actually had, not right in 1996, but shortly after I arrived, marriage equality was enshrined as a right in the South African legal system years before that happened here, which is an incredibly progressive move, especially for that country and where it comes from. And so, on paper, we were the most liberated people the world had ever known. And I ended up, through some connections and meandering, getting a job at the South African Human Rights Commission. And this is an entity that is funded by the government, but independent of the government. Most democracies that have human rights in their constitutions also have an independent watchdog, whose job is to make sure that the government is living up to its commitments to honor the rights that it claims it is giving its citizens. You don't live in one of those countries. We are one of the few countries that has a democracy with rights that doesn't have a similar kind of watchdog. So I got to work at the Human Rights Commission, South African Human Rights Commission, and our job was to investigate claims of violations of rights that were occurring within the country. And there was one particularly horrifying case that we were called to investigate on the northern part of South Africa, right next to the Zimbabwean border, a rural area with farmers. And in that area, a farmer had taken one of the people who worked on his farm, so it's a white farmer, landowner, had taken a man who worked on his farm, had stripped him naked, covered him in toxic paint, and left him out in the road where he died of poisoning and exposure. And what became really clear in investigating not only that case, but what was happening in that community, was that even though we were the most liberated people the world had ever known on paper, the reality was that people in that community who didn't have economic power had no real way to secure those rights. Because when you lived in that community, even though Nelson Mandela was president and the Constitution said we were all free, all the land was still owned by the same people who had owned the land before, who were white. They controlled all the stores, and they controlled access to jobs. And so if you wanted to live there, in many ways, you were completely beholden to a group of people who clearly did not have the same spirit of human rights that was enshrined in the Constitution. And so from that experience and other experiences that I had in South Africa, I was really moved to realize that my old worldview that said if you just understand government and nonprofits, you can make a difference, and that business is something to stay away from, was really challenged, because I recognized myself that I had to understand what we could be doing to create an economic reality that was going to give people the power to realize their rights. And I don't think at all that business and economics is enough. You need a government that's going to protect you, and you need laws that are upheld, and you need the two together. And so I ended up going from that, got a degree in development economics. I sometimes look and act like I'm a business school graduate. I'm not. But I got a degree in development economics, and then realized that it's not enough to understand how economics work. You really have to understand how business works as well. So I ended up going to McKinsey in order to understand how the private sector thinks and talks. At least that's what I told the recruiters. It sounded better than I need to pay for my wedding, and you're giving me a bonus, and the nonprofits were recruiting me aren't. The other thing I didn't say to the recruiters, which I thought about tonight, was they had free wine at the recruiting session. Like, again, you guys, for those of you in business school, you don't think it's a big deal because everyone throws free wine at you. But I was in policy school, so like free food, that's 2 days of not having to go and buy like a 1.5 foot long sub that you can divide into 4 meals and like live off, which we did. So anyway, so I ended up at McKinsey, and I had never been in the private sector. I had worked as a journalist one summer for a struggling newspaper that was for profit. I don't think they were making any profits. That had been my exposure to the private sector, and so I sort of bought into a caricature of what the private sector would be. I really thought that people would be throwing phones and being super sexist and yelling at each other. And I thought I would go there, I would pay off the wedding, I would learn something, and I'd be miserable. That was my assumption going into it. And I have to say, I was actually pleasantly surprised. The people, at least people I met, both the people I worked with as well as my clients, were basically decent people. We didn't throw bones. People weren't overtly terrible. They were really smart. They were really committed. They worked really hard. And what I noticed was a deep well of assets, not just the resources and the money. And I worked with Fortune 50 clients who had spent enough money in a week that would have transformed the healthcare system in South Africa. I mean, that comparison of where money is and what I'd seen, and not even going all the way to that community on the Zimbabwean border, but so much of what we did, there was this huge amount of resources, and not just the money resources, but the resources of talent and the smart people who were working in smart ways and working hard. And yet none of that was being applied to making a difference in the lives of that community on the Zimbabwean border in South Africa that had really motivated me in many ways to begin this journey. And so the question I left that experience with was, what can we do to harness all of those resources of money, of people, of energy, of creativity, to address the issues of our time? And for me, you all have a different concern or a different motivation. But what can we do to marry and harness all that to what actually matters to make the world a better place? And so that question carried me through a series of jobs, first in East Africa, then in the Rockefeller Foundation in New York. And that's where we really answered that question by building a movement around this concept of impact investing. And it's not new. People have been making investments that try to solve social problems while making financial return for at least centuries, I think longer in some traditions. Benjamin Franklin was an impact investor. Happy to tell you that story later. So it's not that it's new, but what we did in 2007 was we defined the term impact investing, though that term was new and hadn't been created. And what it did was it allowed a whole set of people around the world who had some sort of instinct about the idea that a for-profit investment could be a morally legitimate and economically effective way to solve a social problem. And it gave them a way to come together. Because before we had that phrase, you had a long tradition in the United States, going back at least in the 1970s, of impact investing in affordable housing. So making investments where you're trying to get some money back, but the real purpose is to create housing that's affordable for people to live in. There had been an explosion in green investing. Since the 1960s, there had been a movement around microfinance that had started by the time we came up with the phrase impact investing. Already they were getting syndicated loan obligations done by Morgan Stanley and sold to capital markets. So the idea of impact investing isn't new. The language was. And with that language, we really created the ability for people to come together so that rather than saying I'm an affordable housing investor or I'm a green investor or I'm an investor in microfinance, people started seeing themselves as part of one movement. And the movement was this basic idea that you can make a for-profit investment as one way to complement government and philanthropy in solving social problems. And so that's the premise of impact investing. And you don't have to go far to see that it's real. So here we are, we're on 117th Street probably, if there was a cross street. So if you go about 3.5 miles south of here, in Hell's Kitchen, there is a building going up right now. There's an office building being converted into what's called a federally qualified health clinic. That's a health clinic who's, in this case, is going to serve, without asking for price or insurance, people who have HIV, many of whom are homeless. That clinic is going up in part because my organization, Nonprofit Finance Fund, was able to put together a $4 million loan to the people who are setting that clinic up called Housing Works. If you go about another 10 blocks south of there, maybe you probably don't know this if you've come to New York in the last few years, there's a 200-bed homeless shelter on 25th Street between 5th and 6th Avenue. That might surprise you if you guys are from that neighborhood. They got that shelter built about 10 years ago, probably at the last minute of gentrification, where they could still put up a homeless shelter in that neighborhood without the rich people in the neighborhood having the political power to stop it happening. But they got it done, and there's a 200-bed homeless shelter, and tonight, 200 people are going to be living in that shelter, getting a set of services from an incredible organization called the Bowery Residence Committee. In order to make that shelter happen, they had a 30-year lease on an 11-story building. To convert that into a 200-bed homeless shelter, they needed $20 million. And there wasn't $20 million of grant money or of government money to make it happen. But again, our organization was able to provide a $2 million loan at the beginning of that project before the other banks and other people were comfortable lending to them. And ultimately, as a result, there is this, this incredible facility for people in New York who desperately need it. Last example I'll give you is if you go about, Google Map this, if you go about 7 miles east in Corona, Queens. Anyone here from Queens? Hey, there we go. Those are all the NFFers in the back. Hey guys. So in Corona, Queens, there's an incredible project going up that is being developed by an amazing organization called Make the Road New York. Make the Road New York is a group that serves immigrants and refugees in one of the most diverse neighborhoods in the world. And they have an incredible facility that's going up. It took $28.6 million to put that deal together in order for them to be able to create a facility that's going to enable them to provide a range of services to a wide array of new arrivals in New York City. Again, that would not have happened if we hadn't been able to figure out with a lot of partners, and some of my team members are actually involved in making this deal happen, a set of financing that enabled them to get that $28.6 million, get that piece of land, hire a Latino architect as part of their commitment to the community, and put up this beautiful building. And so impact investing is real. There are going to be people who tell you that it's all hype. They're wrong. There are going to be people who tell you that it's all easy. They're wrong as well. But it's real and it's all around you. And I don't even have to go 3 miles away. We've got projects blocks from here, health centers, another immigrant service organization, 126th Street. So it's very real. And at Columbia, you guys don't even have to go as far as 100 yards because 2 of the recent alums of Columbia Business School, both of whom are friends of mine, are people who are really working in this space, in the intersection of business and community. One is Donnell Baird, who started an organization called Block Power and has actually been able to receive investments himself from impact-oriented venture capitalists. And another one is named Keisha Cash. Hopefully she'll come to campus, who started a venture capital fund focused on investing in entrepreneurs of color who are otherwise shut out of the venture capital industry. So it's real and it's here. But the question that I asked at the beginning, sort of, what does this all mean and how is this relevant, has really gotten me to think about what is the role of impact investing in what I've described. And the reality is, investors didn't make any of that happen. We got resources to the incredible people who've made that happen. And so it's really, last year I was really struck by thinking about what does it mean to be a hero? I think our clients are heroes. And I'm incredibly privileged as someone who runs a loan fund that lends to groups like the ones I've just described, and we do it around the country. We work with incredible heroes, and most of them are nonprofits. And often we patronize nonprofits. We say, oh, you guys are so heroic, you work so hard, you don't get paid, it's so wonderful. That's not the kind of heroes I'm talking about. The kind of heroes who have led the organizations that we've been able to lend to are a different kind of hero. And I've been thinking about what does it mean to be a hero. Think of people you guys admire in your lives, either people you knew or people who, historical figures or others. What do they have in common? So for me, people like Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, and my grandmother Lydia Levine had one thing in common. They balanced outrage and optimism. And I think in this age of Trump and Brexit, which we'll get to later, it's very easy to be outraged. I think living in New York, it's very easy to be outraged if you have your eyes open. And if you're not outraged, I would argue that you are either too naive or too complacent to be helpful. At the same time, if you're only outraged, you're going to be too paralyzed to be helpful. And so when I think of my heroes and I think of what they did, they combine outrage and optimism in incredibly powerful ways. So let me just talk about the people I just told you about, those particular three examples. And again, I could do this hundreds of times over in every city we operate in, and a lot of people who we haven't been involved in but others have. So this is Charles King. Now, Charles King in this photo looks a little bit like a punk rock musician, maybe like a 70s guitar jam band guitarist or something. He's the founder of Housing Works. Housing Works is the organization that I mentioned that with that $4 million loan is putting up a new federally qualified health clinic. This picture was taken in the height of the AIDS crisis. And while at first glance it might be funny, if you look into his eyes, you're looking at someone who is haunted. And he's haunted by the fact that the worst plague in 100 years has landed in his community. And when he describes his time, he will say it was walking in that part of Manhattan in the 80s. He said it was like walking around zombies. People who were walking in death. Because they were ostracized by the healthcare system. They were stigmatized. Doctors didn't even treat people who they didn't even have the name HIV. They were being abandoned. And he said it wasn't just the look in the eyes of the people who were dying, it was the look in the eyes of their caregivers. That not only had this plague landed in his community, but it landed in his community at a time when people didn't care. And that was the outrage. And whenever I get pessimistic or despairing, I think about what those guys went through. And in that moment of absolute crisis, when they had every reason to give up hope, they didn't. And it's because they didn't give up hope and because they were able to take that outrage and channel it in optimism and say, we're going to survive this plague, and what's going to be on the other side of it is going to be better. Not just because of the healthcare we're going to get when we transform the way the medical establishment deals with patients now around patient advocacy, but because we're not going to be closeted, we're not going to be stigmatized, we're not going to be putting up with this anymore. And this is Charles King now. He's still got fire in him. But you're looking at someone who has a realistic chance of ending the AIDS epidemic in New York State. Not on his own, but he has been a spearhead of an initiative called the End the Epidemic, which set targets and ended up getting the governor behind them, that there's a very realistic chance, or at least there was until recent developments, that by 2020 the plague would be over. And there's a medical definition of what it means for something like this to be over. But to be able to look in the moments of despair and say, not only are we going to come together as a community, we're going to create this group called Housing Works, we're going to do everything we can to be effective, and then eventually we're going to serve people with the kind of facility that I described. But to have the vision of saying, and we're going to create a whole new reality that's going to be better. That's the kind of heroes we get to work with as impact investors. Again, if you're not outraged by homelessness in New York City, I don't know what to say. There's 60,000 people at least who are going to be homeless tonight in New York City. Many of them are children. We live in a city in which billionaires buy $100 million apartments for sport that they don't live in. And yet you've all seen this all over the place. A lot of reasons to be outraged. But this is the group I mentioned who built that shelter on 25th Street, this is their latest building that's actually up in the Bronx. And what they have done, their amazing organization called Bowery Residence Committee, and similarly, they were created by people who lived on the Bowery, which was actually, it still is a neighborhood in Manhattan, but they were people who had been discarded earlier than the AIDS crisis and treated by society as, you know, alcoholics who didn't have anything to offer and no reason that we had an obligation to help take care of them. And it was the residents themselves. This group that created this building with a lot of financing from, actually, I'm not sure they did it, but they were founded by people from that community themselves who said, we're not going to wait for people from the outside to tell us what to do. We as a group, and it was largely men at the time, came together and said, we are going to help each other build a different future for ourselves. And it was the Bowery Residence Committee, which is now one of the most effective homeless shelter operators in New York City. And they're the guys who put up that shelter on 25th Street. This new project is a testament to their version of optimism. And so they are outraged by homelessness. But they believe there's a fundamentally different way to address it. You don't have to just put up more shelters and just cycle people through shelter beds. You can actually organize the whole system of homeless services around a really simple idea that the point of that system is not just to provide shelter to people, though that's crucial. It's actually to end homelessness. Sounds kind of obvious, but it's not the way the system works. And so what the Bowery Residence Committee did was they said, you know, we've got these great contracts from the city, and as long as we keep that shelter on 25th Street filled, we keep getting paid. But they noticed that people who were graduating out of that shelter were starting to come back sooner. And they said to them, what's going on? And these guys said, well, there's nowhere we can afford to live anymore. So yes, you know, homelessness, a lot of people move in and out. And for a while, they were doing really well at helping people find permanent solutions. It's harder and harder to find any kind of affordable apartment in New York City. And I think it would have been very easy for them to be outraged and to say, hey, you know, we are running this homeless services operation. It is outrageous that New York City has affordability crisis, but that's not our problem. But that's not what the optimists do. The optimists say, it's outrageous and we can do something about it. And so what this building is, just looks like a normal building. It's kind of amazing. It's beautiful. It's got this river view. It's also a homeless shelter and a transitional housing. They basically said, we will build our own affordable housing, and we're going to take the money that the city pays to landlords who operate these slum hotels for homeless people, and rather than booking it as profit and taking it out of the community, we're going to plow it back into subsidizing the affordable housing. So that's what an optimist does, is you own the problem, and you say, it's not something if you really want to solve problems, we can see the future. What these guys have done, and what Charles King and Housing Works did, at the time they were living through the crisis, must have seemed impossible to even see around that curve. And that's what you do when you balance outrage and optimism. And then finally, this is the group of Make the Road New York, who have putting up that facility in Corona, Queens. They are about a 20-year-old organization that works with immigrants and refugees in New York City. I am a chain migrant from a shithole country. I will proudly admit to that. As an immigrant from South Africa, they have a lot of people from other places, and they are outraged, as they should be. And they're outraged by a city that on one hand exploits the labor of their brothers and sisters, and on the other hand tries to create a dynamic in which we as immigrants and their community are considered subhuman. They are on the streets. Every time Jamie Dimon tries to give a speech and they hang a banner or yell at him, the people who work at NFF, some of them get a little worried because we borrow a lot of money from JP Morgan. And they're like, oh, this is a little weird. We're kind of borrowing money from JP Morgan, and then we're like working with these guys. But I love these guys. Follow them on Twitter. They are outraged, and they should be. But they're also optimistic, and that's what they're putting up in Queens. And when you can't see around the curve of your outrage, I don't think you can have the vision to say that that's what our community deserves. And 20 years from now, when that building is not something that makes people impressed, but it's just something that community takes for granted, I think we're going to look back at the moment we're in now and think it's a historical reality that people were stigmatized and ostracized and abandoned in the immigrant community. Just like I hope many of us are able to say the same thing about AIDS. And so when I think about what it takes to do this work well, it's about balancing outrage and optimism. So I did say we did build this as a discussion on what this all means in the age of Trump and Brexit. So this is what I think it means. I'm happy to hear your thoughts when I'm done. I'm not going to be political. If you know me or follow me on Twitter, I'm kind of done pretending that I'm not partisan. I am. I run a nonpartisan 501c3 nonprofit, but I'm not going to pretend that I haven't picked sides. But I don't think that's what this is about. This is not about are you a Republican or are you a Democrat. What I think about what the age of Trump and Brexit is at its most worrying, and it has elements that are actually really exciting about the response, but I really think it's something that actually has been in the water much longer than Trump, and much longer than the nationalists in the UK and Brexit. And that is, there's two fundamental things happening in our society that I think impact investing is called to address. The first is that there is a growing sense that we don't have an obligation to take care of each other. And I'm not claiming or so naive as to say in America that it's ever been perfect, or that the sense of obligation to take care of each other has ever extended to all of us. But I do think there's a growing sense that, things are chaotic, future's unclear, I've got all this student debt, I don't know what's going to happen in the economy, let me just take care of my own. And that spirit, I think, preceded the Trump election, but it's very much part of what Trump tapped into. This idea that we just have to, your real obligation, take care of your family. Don't worry about other people. Build a wall, keep them out. That ethos is the core of what I think is really worrisome about this. And my favorite poet, Bruce Springsteen, has a line that I hope some of you know from Atlantic City where he says, out there's just winners and losers. And don't get caught on the wrong side of that line. And I think the problem is too many people in America have taken that literally. They're like, oh, well, there's going to be winners and losers. There's going to be a line. If you're on the wrong side of the line, you're going to suffer. So let me just get mine. But if you understand that song, if you understand what his life's work is about, you'll know that that's not a recommendation. It's a window into what's really wrong. Because the point is not to say, let me make sure I'm on this side of the line. It's to move the line, or hopefully even get rid of it. And to create a society in which everyone can thrive and have opportunity, and we don't have to create those lines. And so I think partly what's happened is we've created a sense in our society that there's winners and losers, and you just got to get yours. The other objective fact is our time is characterized by gross inequality. And I think they're related, but they're different. So if we don't deal with inequality, and if we don't re-imbue in our society and more people a sense that we have an obligation to take care of each other, I don't see how we can go forward. And so what does impact investing have to do with that? Well, just think about what we did in the 3 deals I described to you guys. We borrowed from JP Morgan. We borrowed from a lot of banks. A lot of the big banks are where a lot of the money that's on the winning side of that line is being hoarded. That money is, all that inequality you hear about, the $100 trillion in the capital market, the thing that when I got to McKinsey, I saw all that wealth and resources that wasn't being put to work to solve social problems. Well, as impact investors, we've done a tiny little thing. We've taken that money from where it was being hoarded, we've borrowed from those banks, and we put it in the hands of Charles King and Housing Works. And we put it in the hands of the Bowery Residence Committee. And we've gotten that money with our partners to put up that building in Queens. And so, in a small way, impact investing, the more we do it, can really be about addressing the fundamental issue of inequality. Because we're taking money from where it's being hoarded and we're putting it into, when we do our work well, places that can create greater opportunity. And then the other question is, what are we doing about creating a sense we have an obligation to each other? Again, without anyone at JP Morgan signing off on it, we created this bond between someone who's HIV positive, transgendered, abandoned by their families, living in the streets of New York, and needs health care, not only health care that's physically delivered, but delivered with dignity in that building that we've helped finance. And we've connected someone's savings in those banks to that project. And at least in some way, we've made those connections happen. But I don't think that's enough. So I could tell you another 100 stories like this, but I don't think we're going to address those core fundamental issues of what it means to be living in this age. We've got to do more. We've got to do more than just unlock a little bit more money. And when we came up with that phrase, impact investing, we intentionally wanted it to hold 2 meanings. The one is that impact investments would be investments that unlock capital for impact, which we've done. There's $100 trillion in the mainstream capital markets. There's these $1 million needs. There's $1 billion needs elsewhere. I know some of you work on climate change. Trillions of dollars we have to spend on transforming the energy economy. And we shake the tree of capitalism. And a lot of people said, hey, capitalism is great. All we need to do is make sure that it's steered a little bit more toward things that are making a positive difference. But there was another meaning of impact investing which was intentional. And that wasn't just investments that had an impact. It was to impact the way investing is done. And that's what I really feel like we're called to do. I think 2 years ago, I might have come here and told you these good news stories about these great deals, the communities we serve, and said, hey, if only we get to do more of it as impact investors, we'll have done our jobs. I don't believe that anymore. Because what the age of Trump and Brexit has really signaled to me is that we've got to do something fundamentally different about creating a way of organizing our economy that really takes care of the second point I made, and that is that reinforces the idea we have an obligation to take care of each other. And I mentioned that Martin Luther King is one of my heroes. He has a speech that actually Donnell Baird, sort of a sermon he gave that Donnell Baird told me about, where he describes what is needed. And what he says is needed is people need to have a tough mind and a tender heart. And now at the time he's talking about, this is early in the civil rights movement, he's delivering a sermon in Birmingham, he's talking about what it means to be an anti-racist civil rights crusader. And I'm weary of saying this and making the parallel of impact investing because it can sound very pretentious. I'm not claiming that any of us as impact investors are going through what the people that he was speaking to went through or what that movement required. But I do find it, for me at least personally, motivating to think about what it would mean to take that wisdom and apply it to what we do. And so what he said was you need to be tough-minded and tender-hearted. And whether you have a job now or you're in school, you're graduating, very few of you are going to in the next 5 years work in impact investing. I'm sorry to say that, but we are a tiny but growing part of a shrinking financial services industry. Most of you are going to be elsewhere. But wherever you go, I think you can really take the spirit of what that phrase means and make a huge difference and contribute in a way that the themes that I've talked about today are relevant, even if you're not directly making deals. So I just want to finish with this. What did he mean by being tender-hearted and tough-minded and tender-hearted? So tough-minded, you might think that, it means you got to be like really brutal and fire people aren't great, and if the math doesn't work on one of your investments, you got to walk away from it, don't be nostalgic. He didn't mean that at all. What he said was, being tough-minded means that you reject half-baked solutions and easy answers. And at the time, the half-baked solution and easy answer he was referring to was racism. Racism gave people an easy way to interpret the world that was half-baked and wrong. As impact investors, our fundamental premise is a rejection of the half-baked solution and easy answer that says the only purpose of investing is to make money. And whether you're a consultant or an investor or you're in finance or you're running a company, your only purpose is to make the shareholders richer. That is a half-baked solution and it's an easy answer. And just like racism, it's the one we've been born into. But you need to reject it. Whether you're an impact investor or wherever you are, reject half-baked solutions and easy answers. And there's a really easy way to do this. Wherever you go in life, whether it's with your family or at work, constantly ask yourselves why. Why is something happening the way it is? And actually, my colleague Chance today in a meeting at work mentioned this. Walk around the world you see and constantly ask why. And then I think it's really simple. To be tough-minded is easy. You just never accept the answer because it's always been this way or because everyone else does it. So, if you're in your investment banking job, where some of you will be, and you sort of say, well, why is it that we are making this investment and we know that this new real estate deal we're doing is going to displace people? And someone says, oh, well, but everyone else is doing it. Or, that's the way it's always been. Just reject that. Be tough-minded. And tender-hearted, similarly, I think it's easy to think, tender-hearted just means, be nice and all that. But Dr. King had a really powerful thing he said about being tender-hearted. Treat people as people. So how many of you who are either investors or have been in business have come across a project or an analysis where you see a bunch of numbers on an Excel spreadsheet? And maybe there's a column heading that says customer acquisition or profit per customer or revenue for something. You're not treating people as people. You're treating people as an input into your algorithm, and your algorithm is solving for some mathematical abstraction called money. Well, I think impact investors do our best work when we avoid that. And I don't think just by being an impact investor you get away from that. It's a tendency we have. Impact investors can also start treating people as inputs. We could take that homeless shelter on 25th Street and say, as long as those beds get filled, we get our loan repaid. So let's really focus on beds getting filled. That's not treating people as people. That's treating people as an input to your revenue. So be tough-minded, treat people as people. And I think that's really what we as impact investors are called to do. Impact investing was born out of the tough-mindedness that rejected the idea that the only purpose of investing is to make money. But I think we have another tough-minded task in front of us, and that is now people are giving us a half-baked solution and an easy answer that says this is all so easy. You can make money and you can do good. You can go and have the same career you would have had, but now you get to make impact investments. If you're a portfolio manager, you don't need to consider trade-offs because all the investments out there can be just as lucrative as they can be impactful. I would be really wary of people who sell you any kind of half-baked solution and easy answer on one side or the other. So I think impact investing can have meaning, but it's going to involve us not only to keep doing more of what we've done, but really do what we can as a movement to push the entire system of investment beyond where it currently sits, where it doesn't treat people as people, and where it really accepts this easy answer and half-baked solution that says wealth belongs to those who currently own it, and they can go out and pursue deals that are trying to make them as rich as possible and feel good about it on the side. So I think there is a role for us, but it's going to call on us to maintain our balance between outrage and optimism and be tough-minded and tender-hearted. And so I realized I just, one last slide. That's Donnell Baird, that's Keisha Cash, I forgot to mention them. I love these pictures because they are filled with outrage. I didn't mention, Donnell's outrage. You wouldn't know from the pictures. Donnell is outraged, and I actually was emailing with him about this today. He's outraged that the communities who are going to be most affected by climate change, of course communities in this country, are basically being abandoned by people who think they know what's best for those communities, who don't believe there's really inherent assets of knowledge and energy in those communities, and an entire system that is built around treating those people as very similar to what happened in the 1980s that Charles King was working with. People are just being left out of agency in their own life story. And so that's his outrage. His optimism is that he built this enterprise called Block Power that's trying to address climate change, get people in renewable energy. Started by saying, I'm going to create green jobs for poor people in the neighborhoods that he worked in. Now he's saying, I'm actually going to be a tech entrepreneur, because it turns out there's a whole tech play. And really having that vision to go beyond what's in front of you and see beyond that. Keisha Cash is outraged by racial inequality, wealth inequality. In the United States, the average white family has about $100,000 of wealth. The average African-American family has $1,600. In Boston, a recent study said that the average white family has $247,000 of wealth, and the average black family has $8, not $8,000. That is outrageous. Keisha Cash is outraged by that reality, but she's optimistic. She's optimistic that if you actually, one of the reasons why that gap exists is because the entire investing system actually systematically denies capital from the great people of color who could be effective entrepreneurs. And she's doing something about it. She has an impact fund backed by impact investors that's making venture capital investments in entrepreneurs of color. So you can do this. It's not an easy path. Not going to be a lot of free wine and receptions. But I want to end with when I mentioned Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela, two of my heroes. This is another hero of mine. That's my grandmother. I mentioned her earlier on. She's actually the one on the right, and it's a little blurry. But if you look at this photo, it's a photo taken in 1950 in Cape Town, South Africa. So if you look at it, this is like, European family. It's her sister-in-law. That's my father, who's going to watch this when it's on video, so hi. He always gets mad at me when I say that the one thing we all have in common as impact investors is that none of us know what our families do for a living. He'll text me and be like, I know what you do for a living. But anyway, he did it back in 1950. But what you don't know from that photo, and it's hard to tell, it's a little blurry, they've just landed in Cape Town as basically economic refugees. And 11 years before that, they were political refugees from the Holocaust. And my grandmother in 1939 fled Hitler's army with a 6-month-old baby, my uncle, the day he marched into Lithuania, and through a very circuitous journey that involved saying goodbye to her family, not knowing that they'd never see anyone again. She ended up in New York. They were here. They actually lived on Riverside Drive, like 5 blocks from here, in an apartment set up by a refugee aid board. So that's what was happening here in 1940. Think about what's happening in Queens today. And they ended up not being able to make it here in New York. Went to Texas. Shout out to Texas. And then ended up on the shores of South Africa. And so what you can't tell really from the photo is, but she's got this incredible sense of spirit. And so I knew her years afterwards. And the legacy she gave me was this unbelievable sense of joy in life. And so I think about, how do you go from what she's been through in the last 11 years to 30 years later being able to convey a sense of joy? If there's anyone in my life who had a reason to be outraged, it's her. And yet she found optimism. So I don't know what you guys believe. I don't know if you believe we're going to meet the people who came before. But we certainly owe them something. And so, as weird as it sounds to say that what we owe them is an impact investing movement that works, I do think that on some fundamental level, I am really honored and privileged to know that the work I get to do every day is part of making this world a more equitable place, a place in which we do extend our sense of obligations to each other And she'll be excited to share about it. I mentioned that I've got some colleagues here. They're mostly in the corner. Sarika told me, do not cry. But then I put up a picture of my grandmother, so I apologize. Anyway, if I put a picture of my baby, I would have started crying at the beginning. So happy to take questions. Would love to hear your thoughts. And I do not take it personally if you all have other things to do tonight. So I'll go all night. I actually have to leave at 8, but I'm happy to have you guys leave. And I'm also happy to be more prosaic, like, you know, how do you get a job in impact investing and all that. Not to be dismissive, if that be your question. Yeah, and if you can say kind of what your salient affiliation is, your name, who you are, and why you're here, and then let me know what's on your mind.
I'm Amantia Mohedini. My relevant salient affiliation is I'm a student at the policy school.
Oh, cool.
CPAC.
I have a policy degree. Good to see a sister here.
I'm here. You said that one of the sort of understandings of the term impact investing is to impact investing. And I've heard lots of people say that the ideal world where we want to live in is one where there's no such term and all investing is impact investing. Is that part of your vision, and what do you think, is that even, sort of, would it ever be possible for that to ever happen? And then if yes, what do we need to get there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when we coined the term in 2007, we were in a room with about 15 people, and the dual meaning of the phrase held that room together. Because there were people in that room who were really happy with capitalism. They were like, hey, capitalism is the greatest way to organize human activity that has gotten all of us out of poverty. Those who have, in their language, those who have the privilege to live in capitalistic societies. And so they were saying, you know, this is great. All we got to do is shake a little bit more for these investments and we'll be fine. But there were other people in that room who were fundamentally more radical and who felt that as a way of organizing, profit maximization had really moral deficits embedded in it, and that ultimately this was a stepping stone. So to answer your question, is it, and I'd say at the time I would have been so thrilled by the first even happening, like, hey, what if we got a few $1 billion to start flowing? Wouldn't that be great? And I certainly, you probably aren't surprised to hear, I have some reservations about capitalism. At the same time that I am very aware of the fact that I have a life expectancy that is a lot longer than anyone who lived in a pre-capitalistic society and all those things. So personally, I think I was not looking around the corner and thinking, hey, if we can just unlock some capital, that'll be fine. But that's not what my heroes did. You know, Charles King didn't look in 1984 and say, if only I can keep 10 of my brothers alive, we'll be okay. He said, this community is going to come out of this, not only going to come out, it's going to come out of it stronger. And what they pulled off, and I'd say two things about that AIDS story. We might end the epidemic, which is unbelievable. There's a whole other set of work that we do at Nonprofit Finance Fund. The group of organizations called the Food is Medicine Movement. Does anyone here know God's Love, We Deliver? Here in New York, they're kind of a well-branded organization. What these guys do, and there's a bunch of them around the country, so it's a long-winded way to get to your answer. I will answer questions. But these guys go around the country, they were all, if you look at it, they were all created between like 85 and 90. And in almost every case, it was a community's response to AIDS. That's how God's Love started, where people simply said, we're not going to allow our brothers to die alone starving. Because as part of AIDS, they weren't getting treated, they were stigmatized, and they were just, no one knew what the disease was doing, but it was wasting people away. And so before there were fancy nonprofits and loan syndicates and all that, there was a community saying, we're not going to let that happen. And they started just bringing food and love. That's what it was. The formula was healthy food and love, and you would bring it to your door. And it turns out that people actually lived healthier, defied the medical predictions. And there was a moment when a lot of these organizations transitioned from delivering food to people with HIV to saying, what we've discovered is that the combination of food and love actually can be really important to a lot of people with other chronic diseases. Heart disease, diabetes, blood pressure. So around the country, there are these organizations now that are delivering food with love to people with a bunch of chronic conditions and proving that not only do you help them stay healthier, it's actually cheaper than treating them in the hospital. And I talked to one of our clients, and we've helped finance them and also advise them on the sort of business model around what they do. And he was describing to me what it was like to be in the board meetings where they have to make this choice of, are we going to now be about more than HIV? because it was it was an existential challenge. Like they were seen as the gay community's response with their supporters to this crisis for their brothers. And now they're saying we could be about something bigger. And he said something really powerful. He said the most profound thing I can do to honor the memory of the people who died is extend this beautiful surprise that came out of their suffering to as many people as possible. So the food as medicine movement is now poised to become, because it saves money, it turns out, a massive movement across the country and around the world that we could really change how we treat people who are poor, who have chronic conditions. So I say all that to say, my heroes demand me to look beyond my own sense of what's possible and say, yeah, it's possible. We could fundamentally change the way we organize capitalism, just like the guys in 1984. And as crazy as that sounds to you all, imagine in 1984 saying to the people who were starting the food as medicine movement, you guys are going to change how the medical system treats people with chronic disease. So yes, I think we can. My biggest disappointment with the impact investing movement in the last few years is that it doesn't seem to be on that trajectory. So what's happened in the last few years, we've won in many ways. It's now becoming mainstream. All the big banks are involved, all the big wealth advisors. Almost none of them now can't have something to say to their rich clients about impact investing. But the danger is they then get to an equilibrium where we unlock a little bit of capital, but we don't fundamentally change inequality in New York, homelessness in New York, gender bias around the world. There are these huge social problems that the energy that is making impact investing happen, which is people's discomfort with the way the world is, could end up being sort of absorbed by the mainstream financial services industry without challenging the core aspects of a question about who has wealth, why do they have it, what's their obligation to use it for more than just their own family's well-being. So I worry at the same time that I think we have a chance, which is an amazing privilege. 12 years after we came up with the phrase, if you had said to me, you're going to actually have that as a worry, that like this whole thing will become part of the mainstream financial industry, we won't make a difference. We won the right to have that concern, which is huge. I put a Google alert out on the phrase impact investing in 2007 after we coined it, and an obscure Australian blogger, does anyone here from Australia? Sorry. So I'd say obscure Australian blogger. I know I'm going to find out it's like your #1 newspaper, but anyway. A Australian outlet used the phrase impact investing, and I was so excited that I sent a note to the president of the Rockefeller Foundation where I worked. I said, this is it, we're on our way, someone's used the phrase. That was the end of 2007. In the summer of, I think it was 2010, President Obama, David Cameron, the Prime Minister of the UK, and the Pope all gave major speeches on impact investing. So, it's amazing what's happened around the rhetoric and the ideas, but are we going to be tough-minded or not? And that's where I don't think it's up to me to answer that. It's up to you all to answer that. I got an email recently from someone who works at a major bank who said, I'm concerned that the private wealth group in my bank is really excited about opportunity zones, which is a new part of the tax code passed in end of 2017 that allows people with capital gains taxes to basically get tax breaks if they invest in poor communities. And this guy wrote to me, he works in one of the largest financial services institutions in the country, and he said, I'm really worried that the private client group doesn't care about poor communities. They just want to help their really rich clients use the tax break. This guy works in the impact unit of this bank. So he said, what can you do to help me, push back? And I just wrote back and I said, it's not for me to do that. What are you going to do? So yeah, I think we could get there, but it's not going to be if the people who are the vanguard of the movement try and make it happen. It's got to be what you all do wherever you sit. And the tough questions you ask and your refusal to take, because we always have them, because everyone else does, is the answer. Yeah.
Thank you for being here. My name is Beverly. I'm a first-year student at CBS. And actually, I was hoping you could elaborate on that last thought, specifically about how we can build equity into this conversation within impact investing and who should be in the room, whether it is at a major financial service institution or if it's at sort of a local community level nonprofit. How do those systems have to speak to each other for it to be equitable?
No, that's great, and I think it's related to the same question. And I think about it as what is the resting point for the impact investing movement? Are we going to unlock a little bit of capital, get really happy about the kind of things I can show you on slides, do another 100 deals, and say that's good enough, and not fundamentally change the way wealth moves in the society, not address the racial wealth gap, and do it all as technocratic outsiders, showing up in a community and saying, we've got an investment project for you. That could be the resting point for this whole movement. And if that happens, my grandmother's going to be pissed. Because that's not good enough. So I think I don't have easy answers, but there has to be a much more sophisticated conversation than there is right now about issues of the racial wealth gap. Who owns capital? Where does that come from? And it's happening on the fringes. It's not happening in mainstream private equity houses and mainstream banks, but like, shame on us if we think that's where it's going to start, right? Like, you can't wait for that to happen. So I think there's some exciting stuff happening on the fringes. My friend Rodney Foxworth, of you guys know a group, Bali. It's a weird name. It's the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies, but he's a pretty visionary guy. It's a group of pretty radical, mostly wealthy people who are kind of really asking those questions, changing who gets to make investment decisions. Why do we assume that the owners of wealth get to make investment decisions? Like, sounds like a crazy question, but it's a question because we always have, because everyone else does. I don't know. So they're actually doing things like putting investment funds together and having community members actually make investment decisions. Another group called Village Capital is doing something where they're arranging groups of entrepreneurs to come together and then creating a seed venture fund in which the entrepreneurs vote themselves on who among them gets the money at the end of a business competition. And they just came out with a report today that shows that result of their first sort of 10 years of doing that includes the fact that the investment decisions that are coming out of that process are going disproportionately more than the rest of VC world, very low bar, to women and entrepreneurs of color. So there's ways that it's happening. But I would say one of the dangers of impact investing is part of the movement is attractive to people with libertarian instincts who say, wow, this impact investing thing is great because I'm skeptical of government. I don't really want to have conversations about, like, those nonprofits, they want to talk to me about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and they want me to put, like, my pronouns at the bottom of my email, and that makes me uncomfortable because I'm like a rich white guy, and I'm kind of, I'm happy about that. So let me be an impact investor because at least I can, like, do good. And a lot of them are actually averse to government because they believe government is a drag, it slows things down. That's really dangerous. And so that part of the movement is completely intellectually and constitutionally ill-equipped to have the kind of conversations you're saying we need, which I agree with. But that's not the whole movement. And so there's another part of the movement that I think is. And then I do think, I hope it's true, that it's increasingly hard to be that unaware of this world if you are younger and in America, part of a generation whose demographics are just fundamentally different. And where another, a set of forces are in place that are going to make it harder to sort of live in an isolated way. I'm really encouraged by that. So I mean, I've avoided using a term to describe a certain generation because it's overused, but you guys know what I'm saying. So yeah, it's hopeful, but there's some really sophisticated conversation happening on the fringes of the movement, and how do we mainstream them? In the back.
Thanks so much for coming and sharing with us this evening. My name's Sarah. I'm also from the policy school, so apologies for infiltrating CBS tonight. My question is about the recent criticism that's been leveled at impact investing and also market-based solutions more broadly in terms like win-win and doing well by doing good. And I think a lot of this criticism has been catalyzed by Anand Giridharadas' recent book, Winner Takes All. And I think that a lot of the arguments he makes are about this being just an opportunity for the elites and the billionaires to give back a few breadcrumbs and make themselves feel better about the capital system that they're perpetuating. So what's your response to that? And is impact investing letting governments off the hook? And is impact investing avoiding a more fundamental change in the underlying system that needs to take place?
I love that question. So I said to Sandra when I got here, like, I really hope that people ask exactly that kind of question. And she said, no, business school students are too polite. So I'm so glad the college students. So a lot to say, no, it's awesome. How many here have read the book or seen an interview or kind of have some engagement with this book, Winner Take All by Anand Giridharadas? So I recommend it. He's a fantastic polemicist. I also recommend following him on Twitter. I feel like he has created a public persona around this issue, and it's a character, and it's really fun. I think there's a lot of pushback around the nuance of his argument, and his defense is that that's not the role I play. He's been trolling Howard Schultz like nobody's business. It's awesome. Anyway, so there's a few things you said. So what you said at the end, a really important point. Are we, by being impact investors, allowing government to get away with not doing its job? Is that a fair interpretation? So I get that a lot, and even in more specific terms. I gave a talk at a social work school about impact investing, and I think I used the example from Bowery Residence Committee, and someone got up and said, the presence of homelessness in a city this rich is a moral outrage. the fact that you are now telling us that you're profiting from lending to a homeless shelter is a double moral outrage. And the fact that you quote Dr. King to support it is unacceptable, and she left the room. And I so appreciate that critique. And it really, I was a little flummoxed. So here's what I say, there's a lot to unpack there. The first is, one of the premises of his book, and this critique in general, it says that if you didn't have impact investing, the alternative is a world in which these problems would be solved. Maybe it's a cop-out. We're not important enough yet as impact investors that we are the reason why the revolutionaries have not stormed the penthouses on 59th Street. Like, we're just not. So Anand's argument that impact investing allows rich people to like burnish their image enough to get away with being capitalistic and rapacious, I just don't think we're, like, I don't know, none of you respect the billionaire more because you found out they're an impact investor. So I don't, like, that I think is a little bit easy to dismiss. The question about is it morally acceptable to profit from homelessness? Well, here's my answer on that one. First of all, you should not have any respect for any impact investor where they aren't already asking that question themselves. So my team, a lot of them are up here. We ask that question all the time. In a really practical way, if we provide a working capital line of credit to a health clinic because the government is delayed in paying on their obligations to pay on contracts, we are very practically letting the government get away with not doing what it said it would do. It's that simple. We ask that question. I have that conversation in the office all the time. Are we really doing good or not? And the way I come down on that, and it goes back to my earlier experience in South Africa. So when I got to South Africa, I was working at the Human Rights Commission, and then quit and worked in the African National Congress political campaign. And we, at the time, that's Nelson Mandela's party, they're still in power, big election coming up. We were in an alliance with the Communist Party and the trade unions. It was called the Tripartite Alliance. And so a lot of people I worked with on the campaign were communists, which in America is this weird stigma. There it was just like, hey, do you like blue shirts? Like, no, I'm a communist. But that's what I was. But there was a point of view. And there was a famous leader of the Communist Party in South Africa, a guy named Joe Slovo, and he had a point of view that you basically had to allow the poor people to suffer enough that they would become revolutionary. I mean, this is one version of how do we get to a utopian society. And the view at the time in South Africa, there was a part of the party that said, if you take people living in slums, so South Africa is a rich country, minimally wealthy, white South Africans in the early 90s, late 80s were the richest subpopulation of any community in the world, and horrible poverty, and completely related. Like, the reason people got so rich is because they exploited the minerals by exploiting people. And a lot of the people, black South Africans, lived in slum conditions. And so the way this was phrased was, so in I worked in the campaign in 99, we'd already been in power for 5 years, and we had started to do things like in the slums where we didn't have enough money or there wasn't a political will to get everyone a house, but we were putting up pit latrines. And so someone in the Communist Party said, in a country this rich, there is no moral right for people not to have houses. And the only reason they don't have houses is because we've allowed the capitalist economy to perpetuate itself. And the only way they're going to get houses is if we overthrow the owners of capital and create a communist society. And so if you guys in the sanitation ministry go out and put pit latrines in those slums, you're going to be subverting the revolutionary spirit that we need to get people to rise up. And that's the only way we're going to truly get to freedom. Like, completely defensible theoretical point of view. I don't have the moral conviction that my comrades had to say that if I have something that I can do to ameliorate your suffering right now, I'm going to tell you that it is in your best interest to not have that and suffer more, which is at the heart of what that argument says. As impact investors, we can organize financing for that center in Queens, which is going to create a better life for a lot of the people they get to serve, whether it's with ESL classes or the legal clinic, or maybe at some point it's going to have to be used as a refuge center, like an actual refuge from violence. People's lives are going to be better off because of that in the short term. Do you have the moral conviction to say, actually, it is outrageous that in a city like New York City, with its diversity and the way that the immigrant community is a core part of who we are, that you have to have a nonprofit doing what the government should be doing for all of our people, not just for documented citizens? And do you have enough conviction to say, so then let's not do that investment because it's just going to make people accept their suffering less? So I don't. So maybe a bit of a cop-out, but I do think if we have tools right now that allow us to do, that's the role I play. When I was young, I was in my teen years, I got to meet a guy named David Brower. You probably don't know him. If you're an environmentalist, you might know him. He was the godfather in the 50s and 60s of the modern American environmental movement. And I met him in 1991 at the time when the Sierra Club, which he had really helped lead, was being outflanked by a group called Earth First. And Earth First were a bunch of radicals. And the founder of Earth First famously once, someone said to him, you know, your vision of the world in which all natural resources are respected couldn't actually sustain the human population. And he said, well, you know, 1 in 3, I forget what the number was, humans are evolutionarily redundant anyway. Like, these guys were radical. The way they stopped rainforests being deforested is they would spike trees so that when the loggers came, the spikes would come and kill them, and therefore the logging companies wouldn't come in. I mean, these guys were radical. And I think I was like 16 years old, and I said to David Brower, like, what do you need me to be? Like, tell me what I should do with my life. And he said, I need you to be you. And I said, should I be you or should I be Earth First? And he said, I need Earth First to be Earth First so that I get to do what I do. And I feel the same way. I don't claim, I think impact investors make the mistake of claiming a righteous, revolutionary role. We don't do that. We've made a choice to be pretty comfortable, to look like this. I'm not Charles King. Charles King has been arrested more times than he can count. That's not who we are. I don't think that's who most of the impact investors are. So I think let's understand the role we can play. Let's play it. Let's not claim the moral authority that goes to people who really are on the front lines, but let's do everything we can be to be their allies. I just want to take a break. If people, I mean, I'm happy people are, but if people want to leave, like I said, don't stick around. I don't know how you want to manage it.
I think we have got lots of questions.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Anyone from Columbia Business School? Okay, yeah.
So I graduated in 2017 with an executive MBA, and so my question revolves around this triad of impact investing, philanthropy, as well as traditional investing. How do you see the interplay there? And then I want to add another layer to that, which is the crowdfunding. Yeah,
so I mean, I often if you go to impact investing conversations, is people talk about deal structures. Like I could go on about a lot of the work we do that's most interesting has philanthropy, government, and investments together. When I got to NFF in 2011, I really thought that like the for-profit world was going to solve so many more problems. Now that I get to work with these amazing heroes like the ones I described, especially in America, most of the problems that are deeply meaningful and are really about social justice are not going to be solved by purely profit-making investments. I don't believe that people who say, well, if they could be, they would have. The market's not perfect, but you are going to have to be creative in how you put deals together. And so a lot of the deals we do, we did a deal in Flint, Michigan. Flint, Michigan, anyone here from Flint? So, you know, downtown, it's a deindustrialized city, abandoned for a lot of economic policy reasons, a lot of racial policy reasons. And downtown was dying, and in the middle of a dying downtown was the newspaper building, the dying industry in the dying downtown. So anyway, we financed an incredible project that took that newspaper building, turned it into a health clinic on the bottom floor, affordable housing on the top floors for med students who are going to be working in the clinic, and then out front is a green, sort of a space for a green market next to the bus station because people don't have access to healthy food. I could describe it as an impact investment and talk about the loans we made. That doesn't happen without philanthropy, and in that case, a local family foundation that is committed to it. So I think if you want to, like I said, a lot of people in impact investing think we're about getting away from government. They're completely wrong. Especially in the US, most impact investments that are truly about social justice at some point have government money involved. Because there's a very low moral ceiling and a practical ceiling about how much you can charge someone who's HIV positive and homeless to go and take a visit to that health clinic. So we don't get to be lenders and get repaid if there's not government policy that supports Medicaid and other policies that support the vision for ending the epidemic in New York that's going to help get that money to that health clinic. So I think we are completely intertwined, especially with government. And then with the most creative foundations are doing some really good work at figuring out how to take what they have, which isn't, I think the mistake they make is they think that their little impact investing funds are unique because it's like they got $100 million and isn't that great. There's no lack of money in our society to solve our problems. There's a lack of risk appetite and will. I think the smartest foundations are the ones who realize that money is not the scarcity they bring to the table. It's social commitment and a willingness to take risk. And the ones who do that are doing some great work. We work with the Kresge Foundation out of Michigan who are really smart in their impact investing that way, and I think there's a lot of other stuff happening around here. And then the second part of your question.
I was wondering, what are you saying with crowdsourcing?
Oh, crowdfunding. Yeah, so if your goal with impact investing is just to figure out the shortest line to the most amount of money, I don't think retail investors and crowdfunding is the way to get there. There is so much wealth that is concentrated in the private banks, in the sovereign wealth funds, and the institutional investors. That's where the money is. And so I used to answer that question very clearly, like, that whole movement is a distraction. Let's just go for where the money is. But that's if you have the first meaning of impact investing. Let's unlock the cash. If you really buy into the second meaning of impact investing, which is we're not just trying to shake out money, we're trying to fundamentally change the way the system works, then I think there's a lot of promise in crowdfunding around the question you asked, which is, how do you fundamentally change the dynamic about who makes decisions and who gets to be involved in investments? And so that's where I am more excited. For those of you who are thinking about your own enterprises, for the expedient short term of just getting funding, as painful as it is to get funding through the mainstream channels, it's still going to be, for most people, more effective. And don't get distracted by the survivor bias in the sample set of crowdfunded organizations you hear about. Because you're going to read about, oh my God, these guys got like $50 million in 3 hours on Facebook. What you're not going to hear about are the 100 entrepreneurs who went bankrupt waiting for their GoFundMe to cross the $100 mark. So I think you got to be super tough-minded when it comes to that. But ultimately, if impact investing just continues to be the playground of rich people, there's no way we get to that second goal.
Thanks.
Over here.
I'm a professional. I work at Citigroup in the community development group.
Oh, cool.
And my question is more around the Community Reinvestment Act.
Yep.
And whether or not you think it has done more good than bad. And also whether you think it should be rolled out globally.
Yeah. So in 1977, so nonprofit finance fund where I work was started in 1980, and we are one of 1,300 or so organizations called Community Development Finance Institutions. We're all certified by the U.S. Treasury Department, and we are the creation of, sorry, what's her name?
Jessica Leon.
Hey, Jessica. Yeah, so Jessica is mentioning something called the Community Reinvestment Act. So basically, in 1977, a regulation was passed that requires banks who want to be in good standing with the regulators, like Citibank and JP Morgan and others, every 3 years, they have to show the regulators at U.S. Treasury Department what they have done to make loans available in poor communities. That's the basis of the biggest part of the impact investing movement in the U.S. And it's important that history, we are the echo. I think of that as like one of the last ripples of that stage of the civil rights movement. So I quoted Martin Luther King. I think that speech he gave that I mentioned was 1958 in Birmingham. 1965, Civil Rights Act gets passed. And then 10 years later, there's a sense that we got, like within my South African example, we got political rights, but our communities are still completely undercapitalized. And there was a recognition that one of the reasons why money was not flowing into mostly black communities in cities was because the banking system was systematically racist. And the Community Reinvestment Act was passed to address that. They said, you guys are not going to self-regulate. We are now going to have to show us, what are you doing to make sure that you are overcoming those biases in your own systems and making capital available in poor communities. So rather than doing it themselves, most of the banks say, well, we don't want to do that, it's not our business. So instead, they lend to us. And then when I make that loan in Queens, or when I make that loan in Hell's Kitchen, and when we made that loan in the homeless shelter, the people we borrow from, Citibank, JP Morgan, all those guys, get a prorated share of our balance sheet's credit for CRA. Does that make sense? So that's how the thing works. I don't know, you guys, did I get anything wrong, Onika? Okay, you're looking at me like you're missing something. So it's been around since 1977. Has it done more good than harm? I mean, I haven't really done the research. It's kind of stunning. Like, talk about not living a life of asking, questions. Why? I have no doubt that I can roll out deal after deal after deal that we have only gotten to do because of CRA. So we borrow money from banks who lend to us because of that regulation. What I described tonight, and I could go on, and my peers in this field could go on and on about specific deals. There's no doubt those have done good. I have no doubt about that. As an entire architecture, I think the biggest critique would be that we have helped make gentrification and displacement happen. My organization doesn't do housing lending, so we're typically lending to nonprofit organizations. But yeah, I think there's sort of two levels. Have the deals themselves on an individual basis done good? I think absolutely. Have some of the deals likely created harm? I would assume so. And then I think the other question is on a more structural basis, has the idea of requiring the banks to do this been a good thing or not? And I think, again, unquestionably, I'm convinced that we need to be regulated into being our best selves. I think that there is an element of CRA that got the banks to do this. The other thing I'd say about that is most of the banks have not lost any money on their CRA lending, or certainly very little. because it turned out that one of the premises of CRA, there was two ways to look at it. One was you are being biased and not lending to perfectly viable borrowers in these communities. And if we don't force you to do it, you'll never discover that your actual risk algorithms are wrong. And that has been really proven out. A lot of the community development institutions who take this money, our repayment rates are great. I mean, our portfolio, we've done about, let's say 430, maybe it's like 500 million by now, 450 or something in our lifetime. We've written off about 4.5 million. Never lost a dollar of our investors' money. And our portfolios have been doing a lot better. You would have been a lot better lending to us in the crisis than Citibank. Sorry. It's like that. 7 years ago, I got a lot of groans. Now you guys are like, I don't know what you're talking about. But anyway. So, yeah, I think the question is, could we do more? One of the challenges of the CRA is that it defines where impact investments in this case need to happen purely by geography. So every 10 years when the census happens, the government just says, okay, in the last sentence, the following geographic locations were deemed as low income. And anyone who does any kind of lending in those communities will now get credit from the regulators. So one of the challenges of the CRA is it doesn't actually go to what is the impact of those investments. By the fact that they're being made in those poor communities, you get credit. That's a huge challenge. In England, they have a similar regulation, not the same requirement, but instead of doing it by geography, they did it by corporate type. So they kind of created a similar regulation that says you have to lend not just to for-profit businesses, but you need to lend to cooperatives and nonprofits. That's another way to do it. It's really hard. And one of the challenges the regulators have had is coming up with an objective way to measure impact that would allow them to know that a loan to Housing Works to put up a health clinic that's going to serve people who are homeless with HIV is better from an impact perspective than putting up a middle-class, multi-unit housing on the edge of a census tract that's gentrifying in Brooklyn. Like, again, viscerally, we know those two aren't, you can't compare the two, but we don't yet have the metrics and the way to really make that objective. And the guys at the Treasury Department are like, hey, we don't want to be jerks about this, but we can't regulate deal by deal. Like, we need some clear ways. So I think there's definitely going to be improvements. The current administration has said they're going to change it. And the first indication of what was going to come out of that wasn't as appalling as one might think things that come out of Washington these days would be. So I don't know. It's up in the air. It hasn't been finalized. Yeah, in the back.
Hi. First of all, me?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. First of all, thank you so much for coming and speaking. My name is Kinza. I'm an undergrad at Columbia, but I actually just finished an internship with the State Department, where I focused on like financing for development and stuff at the UN. So I wanted to know what you thought the role of those more traditional multilateral organizations, particularly like the UN, what role they play in the impact investing space. They tried to pass an impact investing resolution this session. Didn't work out too hot, but hopefully they'll give it another shot. So
yeah, so this has been a really US-focused talk. When I wrote my book on impact investing in 2011, we started by saying, the book doesn't cover everything. The most obvious thing it doesn't cover is US. Not because we don't think it's important, but because the two authors don't know anything about it. So it's kind of funny that like I'm now giving you an entire talk about the US version. Like the international stuff used to be my life, and given where I come from, my motivation into impact investing was about international development. How do we get the 2 billion people in the world that don't have decent sanitation, housing, education, and so forth. So there's a lot of work to be done. I think in a lot of emerging markets, it's slightly less clear. My answer around government. There are some really interesting businesses that you can invest in emerging markets where you actually can have the driver of revenues come from the customer, not government. I think there's a different there. One thing I'd say about the UN is, those of you know, the Sustainable Development Goals are a set of goals that the countries of the world have said we agree that we're going to try and reach by 2030, right? That has proven to be a really important framework to help unlock impact investing capital, especially in Europe where people take the UN resolutions more seriously. What's happening is a lot of the investment bankers now have clients saying, I want to be doing impact investments, and the bankers are like, I have no idea where to start. And increasingly they're going to say, hey, we don't have to decide what the world needs. The UN decided. And you're seeing a lot of investment funds now being organized around the Sustainable Development Goals. And in fact, here in the United States, KKR, one of the biggest private equity funds in the world, is launching a new impact investing fund, and it is explicitly saying they're going to tie their investments to SDGs, like SDG 3, SDG 5, water, gender, and so forth. So it's proven to be surprisingly galvanizing to get people who want to kind of hear about this, like, oh, what could I do? It's fascinating, like not the way you think of, oh, let's pass bills or requirements, CRA, and so forth. So I think that's been really helpful. There is a lot of promise that one thing that impact investing at its best does is it requires people unused to working together to work together. investors know how to maximize returns, development people know how to maximize development. You have to come together, and there's some really interesting projects where UN agencies that have established presence on the ground and real understanding, and Oxfam and others are saying, well, we know how to organize communities in ways that enable them to achieve things. We don't have capital. You guys have capital. Let's marry the two together. Those partnerships can be often premised on some pretty not tough-minded thinking. It's a lot of easy answers, and there's stigma. You have to build a lot of trust. They don't understand each other. They don't have the same language. So I think there's some interesting pockets of where that comes together, but it's not going to be easy, and it's going to really require both sides to have the humility to recognize that they have something to learn from the other. And like I said at the beginning, when I was 22, I didn't have that. I didn't think I had anything to learn from people who sold out to the man. And a lot of people at CBS don't think they have anything to learn from people who are at SEPA and intern at the UN. So if we can't overcome our mutual disdain and skepticism about each other's capacities, we can't make that happen. But there are people who are doing it. And I do, again, without fetishizing generational change, maybe like when you hit your mid-40s, you just lay it all in the next generation and solve. But I do think that there is something different about people who are coming up. You now are coming up in a world in which you can go to a talk on impact investing. So you graduate already understanding this is the way to think about the world. We didn't have that. So I do think there's hope in a new generation coming through who aren't stuck in having to undo 20 years of habits from the bifurcated world. Yeah, over here.
Hi, my name is Owen. I'm also an undergrad at the University major of Financial Economics. After graduation, I will be joining one of the investment banks. And speaking of private equities in your speech, I attended another impact investing conference hosted by Tamer Center. Mm-hmm. And as one of the panels, we had people from KKR and Bay Capital talking about their impact investing strategies. I noticed that their main strategy is still the buyouts that they traditionally do on for-profit companies. So I was wondering what you think about their strategy addressing the impact investing issues and whether they actually do make a meaningful impact, and also, or whether they deserve sort of a criticism of the traditional capital just wearing a good face by labeling the word impact in their just traditional thing.
So that's a great question. So those of you who don't know all this development, so like I said, 2007 we came up with the phrase. We're excited about Australian. In the last 3 years, three of the biggest and most famous private equity funds in America have set up impact investing funds. One focused on the U.S. It's called Bain Capital Double Impact. It is led by the former governor of Massachusetts, who had been a very successful in his corporate career. Then he had been governor of Massachusetts for 2 terms. He was term limited. If there's anyone who could have done anything professionally, he could have. I am really struck by the fact that what he chose to do with his professional life was become an impact investor. So leaving aside whether his fund is doing good work or not, just think about what that means for this movement. It's pretty powerful. KKR, as I said earlier, they are globally going to make investments that support specific sustainable development goals. They also make the claim that they've already looked at their portfolio and identified, I think it's 34 deals with a few $1 billion that they say have already supported the Millennium Development Goals, even though they weren't intentional. And then the last one is TPG, Texas Pacific Group, again, one of the biggest private equity funds. They did something smart. They actually teamed up with a impact investor. There was an investment organization you'd never heard of because they weren't fancy and big, but they were doing really great impact investment deals for years in India. And TPG partnered with them and basically said, rather than us thinking we know how to go out there and find these deals, we're going to partner with someone who really understands it. So I think that's a really good strategy. It's too early to tell. Honestly, if they come here and tell you we're solving the world's problems, that's an easy answer. And if the critics come here and tell you they're not doing any good, it's too early. So, I don't want to shy away from it. I think they will do their best work when they really balance being tough-minded and tender-hearted. I do worry that the tender-heartedness is a really hard one. How do you really put people first when you're still trying to make this work? A lot of what they're saying is their goal is not just to do deals and make a difference. Their goal is to prove to all the investors out there that you don't have to trade off financial return for social impact. There's a lot of data that says you don't have to necessarily, but you can if you choose to, and you can do other things. And so I think they could do good work in isolation. If the entire impact investing industry gets dominated by that mentality, the equilibrium we reach will not be as impactful as we could have. If we end up with a movement that says you can go and invest in Bain Capital and TPG and make your market rate returns, but also recognize that there are other ways to invest that could even be higher impact. And I think they do their best work when they recognize their role in the system, and they are dangerous when they are trying to convey to everyone else that their way is the answer. Thank you. And a lot of them are my friends, so I'm a little weary. Over here. No, yeah.
Hi, I'm Shayla. I'm a dual degree student at CIFA and CBS. I can wear both hats. I wanted to ask you about your thoughts on impact measurement. I think that's another topic that comes up often. I know there's been a new kind of Bono and TPG had this new Y analytics coming out that's going to focus on how to really measure impact. And do you think that the governments or the UN has a role in that to kind of standardize, or who should be, was it the SASB boards, who should standardize that?
Yeah, so again, like it's going to be wonky for those of you who aren't in this whole world. So these three funds came out. Bono is an investor in the TPG fund. He creates headaches for his communications team. So he launched the fund by unhelpfully saying that until he showed up on the scene, impact investing was characterized by good people making bad investments. That didn't help. I would love to go and tell him that 1980s rock is characterized by like long-haired Irishmen who couldn't play music or something. Anyway, so that's how they started. Not great out the gate. And then in Davos a few weeks ago, they announced that he announced that they're going to solve for the world how to measure the impact of investments. And what they did specifically was take a methodology they have developed to assess the impact of their own investments in this fund, spin it into a for-profit company called Y Analytics, and offer it to the world as a service that can help you and your impact investments measure impact. So there's a lot to unpack there. The particular methodology they're using is one that is basically built on decades of something called the social return on investment framework, which basically says whether it's a grant or a for-profit investment, you assess the impact it's going to have, and then you try and quantify the economic value that creates. So one of the examples they used in a Harvard Business Review article that they published about the methodology in December was an investment they made in a company that does, I think it's online trainings for college students to help them not become harassers. Sounds kind of esoteric, but what they said was, if you look at the academic research about harassment, and you look at the number of people who drop out because of it, and you look at the number of people who, kind of suicide associated with it, and then you say, well, if our company that we are investing in succeeds, they can reduce harassment on campus by a certain amount, which then means the economic value of that is X amount. So if we make a $20 million investment, we have calculated that over the next 100 years, or whatever it is, the social value of that good will be, and they put a number on it. That's their methodology. Seems like an interesting way to make decisions yourself internally. I'm pretty suspicious that it's really going to be that useful to have everyone in the world sort of organize around. Two problems so there's a problem kind of around their content of their methodology. The bigger question is, can anyone create a standard? And you ask, is the government's role in doing that? So it's interesting. What allows us to understand the financial return of our investments in mainstream investments are the GAAP accounting standards. So if you guys go and apply for a mortgage, and you're looking at different options, and one says we're going to give you a 4.2% rate, and another one says we're going to give you a 4.3% rate, and one's going to come with 50 points, those, you can compare them, because those terms have meanings. Or if you're going to make an investment, you can say, well, this company is saying that if we invest in them, they're going to generate $1 million of revenue and $2 million of profit, or whatever it is. That'd be hard to do, but you guys get the point. You might not know this, but the only reason we get to make those comparisons is because those terms have a standardized meaning that is regulated by GAAP. GAAP is an accounting principles. It says revenue has a specific definition and profit has a specific definition. Government doesn't regulate GAAP. I don't know if you know that. But GAAP is actually a voluntary association formed by the accounting industry in the early 20th century, who said, we as an industry would be doing better services for our clients in helping them understand their financial picture if we all use the same terms in measuring. So I think there's a really interesting role for government to help bring people together, but there is a precedent where government doesn't necessarily have to make the decisions around the terms. On the other hand, just going back to Beverly's point, who gets to set targets for us as a society? And that's a different question. So there's a question around measurement, and there I think that the industry can self-organize, and government can play a role to certify or mandate a system. There's a much more fundamental question, which is who gets to decide what is good? and who gets to decide what society should aspire to. And there's not a role for government in that, and what's government for? So again, I think there's two parts. You can find an interesting way to self-organize around a measurement, but an impact investing industry or an impact investing fund or any particular impact investment has to be embedded in a deep commitment to understand what the communities we're seeking to address or support, what their aspirations are. And one of the most powerful ways we've had to do that historically is through government. I mean, maybe we can crowdsource it through blockchain, I don't know. But I think there's a deep role for government in doing that, because I would not want to live in a world in which Bono and his friends from TPG get to decide what's good for all of us. So I'll take one more. Give it a break.
So actually, this is a continuation of what you just talked about. How do we define impact investing? Because I'm an alumna of Columbia Business School. I work with a lot of VCs and private equity groups. And there are few, more and more, but still very few impact funds. However, many VCs and private equity guys make tons of money. They need to have commercial returns because that's what they're assessed by. But a lot of them, I do believe, care about impact. And it's kind of fuzzy ground of how you define impact because, okay, well, there are certain sectors like environment, healthcare, education, women founders, minorities, poverty, equality. That's an obvious impact, but you can debate that a lot of the businesses that they support also have an impact. So, for example, take Flipkart. It's India's Amazon. I mean, that has a huge impact. So, right, Amazon has a huge impact. So how do we define this impact, and do we need to have these dedicated pockets of money with a single strategy, or is it more about just drumming up this topic and PR and kind of just appealing to the better part of the human nature?
So I think that brings together a lot of what we've been talking about. So first of all, we need everyone. I need a VC who, in his profit or her profit maximizing activities, stumbles into a deal that happens to be good for the world. That's great. I'm not going to tell them not to do that deal. But I would ask you, do we live in the world that we should be living in? When you meet your ancestors and you say, "This is what I did with my time in the world," if you're not outraged, then then it's working. So hey, business as usual. VCs get to pursue profit maximization. Their LPs are happy. That's the people who invest in their funds. They get to raise the next fund. If it's all working, then don't get involved in this because this is hard. This is a new way of trying to organize activity. So you've got to build that's why I say you've got to build your excitement about impact investing from a place of outrage. There's got to be something that you say is not working in the world, and not just in the world out there, but in the way the investment world works. So I personally think capitalism has been hugely beneficial for a lot of people. It's done a lot of good for all of us in this room. And there's a lot more to do. And I don't think the trajectory we're currently on with our entire financial system organized around profit maximization is coming up. I mean, Donnell would be really mad at me if I didn't talk about climate change. There's a fundamental question about what we're doing. So we need all that to happen. We need those guys to be doing what they're doing. We also need people to be pushing the boundaries, not just of the kinds of deals they're doing, but of how they're engaging in communities and what kind of expectations they are setting for investors. So why is it that the VCs you work with will say, I have to maximize profits because it's what everyone, again, because everyone else does it, and because it's the way it's always been. How do we get beyond that as a default? Do you have to maximize profits? Well, in the current system, you have to, if what you want to do is raise the second fund from the same people who have that point of view. But there are a lot of other people like Keisha Cash who are pushing a different path. So I say, I still want the 10 to be as big as possible. It's why impact investing has the two meanings, and I'm still trying to hold that together. But I am really weary of what you said at the end, which is that in impact investing, we are giving, and I hate to be blunt, rich white men an excuse to feel good about themselves. And if that's the legacy of all of this, and we don't address some of these other fundamental questions, then I'll be really nervous about meeting my grandmother.
It's more a question of what is impact? To me, impact is solving a real world problem, and that's such a broad definition. Right? So healthcare, obvious impact. But there's so many other areas where I can argue that this company is building a product for which there is a market need and they're going to improve the lives of women.
Well, I think
It's
a lot of
not
companies
as
have.
obvious as
Yeah.
poverty.
No, and it's not black and white, and a lot of people in the investment world they're attracted to the investment world because of its clarity, and we can't offer that, and we're not going to. And I think there's a danger when people try and get reductionist and say, just give me a formula that allows this to be in and this to be out. I mean, it's an unsatisfactory answer, but if I was trying to give you a clear answer, I wouldn't be respecting sort of the complexity of it. So, thanks everyone.
Thank you.